from a refugee camp. He came from a broken Ohio home. But when Vice President JD Vance opened one red folder in a packed hearing room, Ilhan Omar's confidence began to crack, and what followed exposed money, loyalty, and a question so devastating that the cameras caught the exact moment Washington realized her silence said everything to America. She came from a refugee camp in East Africa, a place where survival meant waiting in endless lines for water, flour, and the fragile promise that someday another country might open its doors. He came from a broken house in Middletown, Ohio, where survival meant learning how to sleep through shouting, police sirens, and the quiet humiliation of having the electricity shut off because the bill could not be paid. Both of them knew what poverty looked like when it stopped being an idea and became the air you breathed every single day. Both of them knew the taste of uncertainty, the strange, hollow feeling that lives in a child's stomach when dinner is not guaranteed, and tomorrow always looks exactly like yesterday. Both of them grew up in places where hope did not arrive naturally, where it had to be fought for, sometimes clawed out of circumstances that seemed designed to crush it. But on that morning in Washington, inside a Senate hearing room filled with cameras and polished wood and the weight of the federal government, only one of them had spent years building a political career inside the system that claimed to fight poverty, while billions of dollars quietly disappeared from the very programs meant to relieve it. In exactly 41 minutes, the Vice President of the United States would ask a 7-term Congresswoman a question she could not answer. Not because she lacked intelligence, not because she misunderstood the facts, but because the truth contained inside that answer was the one thing no politician could survive once it was spoken out loud. The clock had already started counting down. Representative Ilhan Omar did not know it yet. She walked into the hearing room with the confidence of someone who had survived nearly every political storm Washington could create. For years, she had endured investigations, accusations, headlines, threats, and political attacks that would have ended the careers of most members of Congress. She had emerged from each one standing, sometimes stronger, sometimes louder, always defiant. Washington had tried to corner her many times before. Washington had never succeeded. The man sitting across from her that morning understood something about storms. JD Vance had grown up in a house where storms were not political metaphors. They were real events that shook the walls at night. His childhood had been a rotation of instability that many Americans would recognize instantly. A mother trapped in addiction, a father who disappeared early, a neighborhood where hope often arrived too late to matter. There were months when the water stopped running because the bill had gone unpaid for too long. There were mornings when school meant pretending everything was normal while wearing clothes bought from Goodwill because there was no other option. There were nights when survival depended on a grandmother who slept with a loaded shotgun beside her bed because the world outside their door did not always respect the idea of law. Ilhan Omar believed she knew what hardship looked like. JD Vance knew what it sounded like when it was screaming in the next room. By 9:15 that morning, the hearing chamber was already full. Staffers lined the back wall shoulder to shoulder. Reporters filled the press section with laptops balanced on their knees, fingers hovering over keyboards waiting for the first moment that would matter. Television cameras stood in rows like mechanical witnesses, their red recording lights already glowing. Washington had seen countless hearings before, but something about this one felt different even before it began. There was tension in the air that experienced reporters recognized immediately. It was the tension that appears when people suspect that someone in the room might leave with their career permanently altered. The official title of the hearing sounded harmless enough: Minnesota Fraud and federal program integrity. Bureaucratic language has a way of disguising the real nature of political conflict. On paper, it sounded like an ordinary oversight hearing about government spending and regulatory failures. In reality, the documents sitting inside a red folder on the table in front of the vice president suggested something much more explosive. The numbers attached to those documents did not describe accounting errors. They described a scale of fraud so large that federal investigators were already comparing it to the biggest pandemic relief scandals in American history. Ilhan Omar arrived with the type of entourage that successful politicians build over years of power. Attorneys, staff members, communications aides, and political allies followed closely behind her as she moved through the chamber. The gallery on the left side of the room filled with supporters wearing identical shirts printed with the words, "Protect Ilhan." Their signs had been professionally produced. Their chants had been practiced. The performance of solidarity had been organized long before the hearing ever started. Members of the media noticed the details immediately. CNN had already prepared the graphic that would appear beneath their live coverage. Omar faces GOP attack on Minnesota programs. The storyline was already written in the minds of many commentators before a single question had been asked. It was a familiar political script. A progressive congresswoman facing criticism from conservative investigators. A clash of ideologies that cable news audiences had seen dozens of times before. Omar walked to her seat with the composure of someone who had performed this scene many times before. Her navy blue hijab was carefully arranged. Her blazer was tailored and precise. Her expression held the defiance that television cameras often captured so well. For years, that expression had served her effectively in political battles. It signaled confidence to her supporters and frustration to her critics. It told the world she had no intention of apologizing for anything. Across the polished mahogany table, 12 feet away, one chair remained empty. At 9:58 a.m., those are exactly 2 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin, a side door opened quietly. JD Vance stepped inside. There was no large entourage, no visible group of aides surrounding him, no dramatic entrance meant to attract attention, just a man in a dark suit carrying a single red folder under his arm. The folder was impossible to ignore. In Washington, a red folder had begun to carry its own symbolism over the past few years. The color had become associated with moments when someone intended to reveal something the rest of the room did not yet understand. JD Vance placed the folder on the table in front of him. Then he sat down and waited. He did not open it. The gavel had not even struck the table when Ilhan Omar leaned forward toward the microphone. Years of political combat had taught her that the first voice heard in a hearing room often shapes the narrative that follows. If she could frame the hearing before the vice president spoke, she could turn the entire event into another example of partisan harassment. She began speaking with the practiced confidence of someone who believed she understood exactly how the next hour would unfold. Across from her, JD Vance listened without interruption. His hands rested calmly beside the red folder. His expression remained unreadable. The cameras recorded every second. Many people in the room believed they were watching the opening act of another predictable Washington confrontation. A congresswoman defending her record. A vice president pressing questions about oversight and accountability. Political theater designed for television audiences and evening news programs. But inside the red folder on the table sat documents arranged with meticulous precision. Bank records, financial transfers, Department of Justice filings, evidence tied to federal investigations already underway. And at exactly 6 Honquar that morning, hours before the hearing began, one final piece of information had arrived in the vice president's inbox. That final piece had confirmed what the rest of the documents already suggested. Once it was presented in the hearing room, the narrative Ilhan Omar had prepared would no longer matter. Because numbers have a strange power in politics. Arguments can be debated. Motives can be questioned. But numbers simply exist. And the numbers waiting inside that red folder told a story that Washington had not yet heard. Ilhan Omar did not wait for formalities. The moment the microphone light turned red, she leaned forward with the confidence of a politician who believed the room already belonged to her. Years in Congress had trained her instincts well, controlled the narrative early, defined the conflict in moral terms, and forced the opponent to defend themselves before they ever ask a question. If she could frame the hearing as an ideological attack, the facts inside that red folder would never matter. "Mr. Vice President," she began, her voice steady and sharp, the voice of someone who had fought political battles for nearly a decade. "Let me be absolutely clear about what this hearing actually is. This is not oversight. This is not accountability. This is a political stunt designed to target immigrants and communities of color. This is ethnic cleansing by committee." The gallery on the left side erupted instantly. Applause filled the room. Several people stood from their seats, raising the Protect Ilhan signs that had been prepared hours earlier. One woman shouted from the second row, her voice cutting through the noise, "Tell him, Ilhan!" Another man pumped his fist in the air, as if the hearing had already been won. Omar pressed forward, sensing momentum. Her words came quickly now, fueled by the rhythm of political confrontation that had defined her public career. "Your administration has repeatedly insulted immigrants," she continued. "The president has called countries like Somalia disgusting. He has threatened to send people like me back to where we came from. And now the Vice President of the United States is sitting here pretending to care about oversight, while targeting the very communities this country once promised to protect." Cameras clicked rapidly. Reporters leaned closer to their screens, typing sentences that would appear online within seconds. The story was unfolding exactly as many of them expected. A confrontation between a progressive congresswoman and a conservative administration official. Omar turned fully toward Vance now, pointing directly at him. "You grew up in Ohio and wrote a book blaming poor people for their own poverty. Then you married into Silicon Valley wealth, took funding from billionaires, and now you stand here lecturing immigrants about the American dream. You are a fraud, Mr. Vice President. A hillbilly costume worn by a venture capitalist." The applause grew louder. Several journalists exchanged glances, recognizing the kind of line that would dominate political coverage later that afternoon. A CNN reporter whispered to the cameraman beside him, barely hiding his excitement. "She's destroying him." A Democratic senator sitting further down the dais nodded quietly, his expression suggesting the same conclusion. The narrative was already forming inside the room. A confident congresswoman dismantling a vice president who had underestimated her political experience. Omar did not slow down. "You have no connection to Minnesota," she continued. "You have no understanding of the Somali community. You have never administered these programs. The only reason you are here is because Donald Trump told you to be here." She paused just long enough for the cameras to capture the next line clearly. "Today, you are not the Vice President of the United States. You are an errand boy." The applause reached its peak. Omar's staff members were smiling. Her communications director was already typing rapidly into a phone, drafting the statement that would be sent to reporters within minutes. From their perspective, the hearing had already achieved its purpose. The political frame had been established. Now the vice president would spend the rest of the session trying to escape it. Across the table, JD Vance finally moved. He did not respond immediately. He reached slowly toward the microphone, adjusting it slightly closer. Then he looked directly at Omar. "Representative Omar," he said quietly. The room gradually settled. It was not dramatic silence. It was the natural pause that occurs when a crowd finishes cheering and expects the next act to begin. "You just called me a fraud. You said I don't understand poverty. You said I wrote a book blaming poor people for being poor." He paused. The pause was not theatrical. It felt more like someone deciding how much of their past they were willing to place in front of a room full of strangers. "My mother was a heroin addict." The words landed differently than anyone expected. They were not delivered as a political defense. They sounded like a simple fact that had been carried for a long time. "She overdosed so many times that I stopped counting. My father left before I could remember his face. I was raised by a grandmother who kept a loaded gun under her mattress because in our neighborhood the police did not always come in time." The noise inside the hearing room faded slowly. A few reporters stopped typing. A camera operator lowered his headset slightly, listening more carefully now. "The water in our house got shut off every other month because we couldn't pay the bill. I wore clothes from Goodwill until I was 16 years old. I joined the Marines at 18 because I didn't know how to apply to college, and nobody in my family had ever tried." Vance looked directly at Omar again. There was no anger in his expression. What replaced it was something more unsettling: recognition. "So when you sit there in your tailored blazer and tell me I don't understand poverty," he said slowly, "with all due respect, ma'am, you have no idea who you're talking to." The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a congressional hearing where people simply wait for the next speaker. A deeper quiet. The kind that settles when a room realizes the conversation has shifted somewhere unexpected. Omar's supporters did not applaud this time. They watched carefully, uncertain whether the moment required silence or reaction. In the back row of the gallery, a woman named Maria Gonzalez sat with both hands folded around a photograph. She had driven from San Antonio to attend the hearing. Most people in the room did not know her name. They did not know why she was there. They only noticed the picture she carried. It showed a young man wearing Marine Corps dress blues. He was smiling in the way 24-year-olds smile when the future still looks endless. His name was Sergeant David Gonzalez. He had served with JD Vance in Iraq. In 2007, outside the city of Ramadi, his vehicle struck an improvised explosive device planted along the road. The explosion killed him instantly. He left behind a wife and a 3-month-old daughter. Maria Gonzalez held the photograph carefully, the way people hold objects that have become permanent pieces of their lives. When she received the phone call 2 weeks earlier asking if she would attend a hearing in Washington, she did not ask many questions. The man who called her had said only one thing that mattered. "Mrs. Gonzalez," the voice explained, "the Vice President would like you to be present. This hearing is about accountability. Your husband would have wanted to be here." She agreed immediately. Now she sat quietly in the back of the room, waiting without knowing exactly what would happen next. At the witness table, JD Vance finally reached for the red folder. The movement was deliberate. Every camera in the room followed it automatically. Inside the folder were documents arranged with the precision of someone who had spent years studying how government investigations unfold. Each section was labeled, each page tabbed and color-coded. The evidence had been organized so that anyone watching could follow it step by step. Vance removed the first document and held it up just high enough for the cameras to read the header printed across the top. United States Department of Justice, District of Minnesota. "Let's talk about money," he said. He placed the document on the table. "Specifically, let's talk about $1 billion. Several reporters stopped typing. The number hung in the air for a moment before anyone reacted. $1 billion. Vance reached into the folder again, pulling out additional documents and laying them across the table in front of him. Each page added another layer to the story the room had not yet heard. "The Feeding Our Future program," he continued, "was a federally funded child nutrition initiative created during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was designed to feed children who were suddenly out of school and struggling to find regular meals. It operated in Minneapolis, in your district, Representative Omar." He pulled out another sheet. "As of today, 78 individuals have been indicted in connection with fraud connected to that program. More than 50 have already been convicted, pleaded guilty, or been found guilty at trial. The Department of Justice has described it as one of the largest pandemic relief frauds in American history." The room was no longer quiet out of politeness. Now it was quiet because people were trying to understand what they were hearing. Vance placed another page beside the first. $300 million, he said. "That is the amount investigators believe was stolen from a program meant to feed hungry children." He continued arranging the documents in front of him like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting for someone to assemble them publicly. The defendants created fake food distribution sites. They fabricated attendance rosters filled with children who did not exist. They submitted invoices for meals that were never cooked, never served, and never delivered. One location in Minnesota claimed to serve 2,000 meals every day from a storefront roughly the size of a gas station convenience store. There was no kitchen, no staff capable of producing that amount of food. Just paperwork designed to convince the government that children were being fed. "But feeding our future was only the beginning," Vance said quietly. And as the cameras zoomed closer to the red folder, the room slowly realized that the real hearing had only just begun. But feeding our future was only the beginning. JD Vance did not raise his voice when he said it. He did not lean forward dramatically or try to dominate the room with anger. Instead, he continued laying the documents across the polished wood in front of him with the steady patience of someone who understood that evidence speaks louder when it is presented calmly. The cameras zoomed closer to the table, capturing the growing line of official reports spreading across the surface like a map of a financial disaster. "Let me introduce you to the rest of Minnesota's fraud crisis," he said. He lifted another document from the red folder. The page was marked with a federal audit summary and several highlighted figures that reporters in the press section immediately began photographing. "The autism therapy program," Vance continued, "saw providers increase by more than 700% in just 5 years. 41 providers became 328. In the same time period, billing increased by 3,000%, from $6 million to $220 million. Several senators shifted in their chairs. Even those who had arrived expecting another partisan confrontation now recognized the scale of the numbers appearing on the table. Most of these providers were billing the government for services they never delivered, Vance said. Patients who often did not have autism. Sessions that never happened. Treatments that existed only on paper. He placed the document beside the Feeding Our Future report. The stack of evidence continued to grow. And then there is the Housing Stabilization Program, a program originally budgeted at $12 million. Actual spending reached $32 million. He looked down briefly at the page before continuing. Providers billed the government for housing services they never provided. Payments were issued to organizations that did not manage housing. Individuals were listed as receiving assistance who had never interacted with the program. The room had grown noticeably quieter now. This was no longer a hearing about political rhetoric. It had become a presentation of numbers that painted a picture far larger than the accusations that had dominated headlines earlier that week. Vance placed his pen down gently beside the documents. "When you add the numbers together," he continued, "300 million from Feeding Our Future, 220 million from the autism program, and more than 300 million from housing stabilization investigations currently underway. The acting United States Attorney for Minnesota has stated that when all investigations are complete, total fraud connected to programs administered in that state could exceed $1 billion. $1 billion. The number hung in the air again, heavier now that it had been connected to 3 separate programs. It was no longer an accusation about a single investigation. It had become a pattern. Vance finally looked directly at Ilhan Omar. $1 billion, he repeated slowly. Money intended to feed hungry children. Money intended to help families find housing. Money intended to provide therapy for autistic kids. All of it administered through programs operating inside your district. Omar leaned forward slightly, her expression tightening as she listened. Her attorneys were whispering quietly behind her. The room could feel the shift beginning. But Vance was not finished. "And here is the part that connects you directly to the policies that allowed it," he said. He reached into the folder again and removed a printed copy of legislation. The page carried the formal formatting of a federal bill introduced during the height of the pandemic. "In 2020, he continued, during the early months of COVID, you introduced legislation known as the Meals Act." He held the page slightly higher so that the cameras could capture the title clearly. "Your bill removed federal oversight requirements that previously governed how emergency food programs were monitored. It created a waiver system, allowing states to bypass several of the safeguards designed to prevent fraud." The Vice President lowered the document back to the table. "You built the door," he said calmly. "You removed the locks. You disabled the alarm system. And when $1 billion walked out through that open door, you told the American people it was somebody else's fault." A low murmur moved through the hearing room. The accusation had been framed not as speculation, but as a logical sequence of policy decisions and financial consequences. One of Omar's lawyers leaned closer to her microphone and whispered urgently. She waved him off again, determined not to appear shaken in front of the cameras. But Vance continued before she could respond. "You also received campaign donations from individuals later indicted in connection with this scheme," he said. "You returned the money. But only after those individuals were arrested. Not when the investigation began. Not when the fraud was first reported. After the handcuffs went on." The room was completely silent again. Every reporter in the press gallery understood that the hearing had crossed into territory that would dominate political coverage for days. Then Vance reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The gesture seemed almost casual, but the room immediately sensed something significant was coming. "This morning," he said, looking down at the screen, "I received authorization from Acting United States Attorney Joseph Thompson to share one additional piece of information with this committee." He read the line slowly. "The Treasury Department investigation has identified financial transfers from accounts linked to the Feeding Our Future fraud network to entities associated with Al-Shabaab." For a moment, no one reacted. It took several seconds for the name to register across the room. Al-Shabaab, the Somali terrorist organization responsible for attacks across East Africa. The group responsible for the Westgate Mall massacre in Nairobi. The bombing in Mogadishu that killed more than 500 people. Money stolen from children's meal programs in Minneapolis might have helped fund terrorism. The silence that followed was deeper than anything earlier in the hearing. It was the kind of silence that arrives when a room collectively understands that the conversation has entered extremely dangerous territory. Omar leaned forward suddenly. "That is a lie," she said sharply, breaking the stillness. Her voice was louder now, the controlled tone from earlier replaced with visible anger. "There is no evidence connecting me to terrorism." Vance did not raise his voice in response. "I did not say there was evidence connecting you to terrorism," he replied evenly. "I said you wrote the law that made the fraud possible. The fraud that may have funded terrorism. Those are facts. The rest is what investigators are currently examining." He placed the phone back on the table. "And they are examining it in your district." Several reporters glanced at each other. They understood the implications instantly. The story had just expanded far beyond fraud investigations, but the red folder was not empty yet. Vance opened the next section. "Let's talk about loyalty," he said. A staff member behind him activated the hearing room monitors. Video footage appeared on the screens surrounding the chamber. The image showed Ilhan Omar speaking at a gathering in Minneapolis. The audio captured her voice addressing a Somali audience. Subtitles appeared at the bottom of the screen. "While I am in Congress, no one will take Somalia's sea." The crowd in the video cheered loudly. "The United States government will do what we tell the United States government to do." More cheering, and then the line that made several people in the hearing room shift uncomfortably in their seats. Omar referred to the president of Somalia as "my president." Vance paused the video. The image froze on the screen. "You pledged to use your position in the United States Congress to protect Somali territorial interests," he said quietly. "You told a foreign diaspora community that the American government would follow their direction. And you referred to the president of Somalia as your president." He reached back into the folder and removed a single sheet of paper. "This," he said, holding it up, "is the oath of allegiance required for naturalization as a United States citizen." He began reading. "I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty." He lowered the paper slowly. "Absolutely and entirely renounce. Not partially, not sometimes, not when it is politically convenient. Absolutely." Then he looked directly at her. 24 years after taking that oath, you stood before a camera and called a foreign leader "my president." You pledged to use your seat in Congress to protect the territorial waters of a foreign country. And you told a foreign audience that the American government would follow their instructions. He paused. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "you have one president. His name is Donald J. Trump. He is the President of the United States, the country that gave you citizenship, the country that gave you education, the country that gave you a seat in Congress." Then he asked the question that would soon dominate every news broadcast in America. "If the president of Somalia is your president," Vance said quietly, "whose congresswoman are you?" The question landed in the hearing room like a detonation that nobody had seen coming. Not loud, not theatrical. Just a sentence that hung in the air with a kind of weight that forced everyone present to process its implications before anyone dared speak again. Because it was not the kind of question that could be answered easily. It was the kind of question that contained its own trap. If Ilhan Omar said, America. The video that had just played on every monitor in the room would contradict her answer. If she said Somalia, her political career would end before the microphones were even turned off. And if she said nothing at all, the silence would tell its own story to the millions of people watching the hearing unfold across television screens and phone displays throughout the country. For several seconds, she did exactly that. Nothing. Her lawyers leaned closer, whispering urgently in her ear. A staff member behind her shifted nervously in his chair. Supporters in the gallery glanced at each other, waiting for the response that never came. Silence in a congressional hearing is not empty. It becomes evidence. Vance did not interrupt it. He allowed the quiet to expand until the absence of an answer felt louder than any argument. Then he reached back into the red folder. But it wasn't just your words at that event, he continued calmly. He removed another document and placed it beside the others. The growing line of papers across the polished table had begun to resemble a timeline of accusations that no longer looked theoretical. At that same gathering, he said, a former Prime Minister of Somalia addressed the crowd. Hassan Ali Khaire. The name echoed softly through the hearing room. He stood on stage beside you and told the audience that your interests were the interests of Somalia, that your work in Congress served the Somali people, not Minnesota, not America. You stood there while he said it. You smiled. You never corrected him. The implication did not require further explanation. A foreign political leader had stood on American soil and suggested that a sitting member of Congress worked for his country, and she had not objected. Vance closed that section of the folder and opened another. But let's talk about something else you've accused others of, he said. You accused Jewish members of Congress of having divided loyalty because they supported Israel. Those were your words. You said their allegiance was divided. You said it was all about the Benjamins. The reference drew a visible reaction from several people seated further down the dais. You argued that supporting the interests of another nation while serving in Congress represented a conflict of loyalty. He leaned slightly forward. So when Jewish Americans support Israel, you call it dual loyalty. But when you pledge to defend Somali territorial waters from the floor of Congress, he paused just long enough for the logic to settle into the room. What do you call that? Again, the structure of the question left no safe answer. Either she condemned her own behavior, or she abandoned the accusation she had used against others for years. Once again, Omar said nothing. The room understood what that silence meant. Across the country, millions of viewers watching the live broadcast reached the same conclusion at exactly the same moment. Hypocrisy. But Vance had not reached the end of the documents in the folder. He moved quickly now, the pace shifting from quiet presentation to something closer to the rhythm of a prosecutor laying out financial evidence before a jury. Let's talk about your money, he said. He placed several financial disclosure forms on the table. These are official congressional financial reports signed by you and filed with the clerk of the House. He tapped the first one. 2012. 22. Your reported net worth was less than $250,000. Student loans, credit card debt, a congressional salary. Nothing unusual for a member of Congress who had built a career through public service rather than private business. He placed another report beside it. 2023. The same. Then he lifted the third document. 24. He paused. Your financial disclosure now reports a net worth between $30 million and $44 million. The number rippled through the room like a shockwave. Even reporters who had been typing constantly now stopped for a moment, staring at the page in disbelief. In 1 year, Vance continued, your reported wealth increased by more than $40 million. He picked up a small calculator from the table. A congressional salary is $174,000 per year. Multiply that by 7 years in office. The screen displayed the result as he turned it toward the cameras. $1.2 million. That is every paycheck you have ever received as a public servant. Then he looked up again. You are reporting $44 million. Where did the other $43 million come from? He answered his own question before anyone else could speak. The answer begins with your husband. Tim Minett. He placed another document down. The man you began a relationship with while he was still married. The man whose consulting company received more than $1.5 million from your campaign. The man whose ex-wife testified under oath that your campaign funds were used to pay for romantic trips. Paris. Napa Valley. Luxury hotel suites. Trips where no campaign events were scheduled. The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. The documents carried enough force on their own. Campaign donors in Minnesota believed they were contributing to progressive politics, Vance said. They believed their $20 donations would help support public policy. Instead, those donors paid for your affair. And when the affair became public, and you married Mr. Minett, he flipped another page. The payments did not stop. They increased. Your campaign paid his company more than $1.1 million in a single year. The hearing room had fallen into a stunned quiet again. Vance closed the folder slowly. The stack of documents remained on the table in front of him, like the record of an investigation that had just unfolded in real time. Then his posture changed. His voice lowered slightly. March 2019, he said. You spoke at a fundraiser for the Council on American Islamic Relations. At that event, you described the worst terrorist attack in American history. He did not look at any document now. He recited the line from memory. Some people did something. The words echoed through the chamber. 19 hijackers murdered 2,977 Americans, Vance said quietly. Fathers who kissed their children goodbye that morning. Mothers who called from burning buildings. Firefighters who ran upstairs knowing they might never come back down. And you reduced all of it to a sentence about some people doing something. He turned toward the back row of the gallery. There is a woman in this room today named Maria Gonzalez. She is holding a photograph of her husband, Sergeant David Gonzalez. He served with me in Iraq. He was 24 years old when an IED killed him in Ramadi. He left behind a wife and a daughter who was 3 months old. The room was completely silent now. David died fighting the ideology behind the attack you dismissed so casually, Vance said. He died in the war that followed September 11th. He died believing the country he served would remember why that war began. Maria Gonzalez stood quietly in the back row. She lifted the photograph so the cameras could see the young Marine smiling from inside the frame. No words were necessary. The hearing room understood the message. A Capitol police officer standing near the gallery recognized the uniform in the photograph. Without thinking about protocol, he stepped forward and saluted. The gesture was small, but it carried more meaning than any speech delivered that morning. Across the country, millions of viewers watched the moment unfold in complete silence. Inside the hearing room, the red folder sat closed on the table. The documents it had contained were now spread out before the cameras like the record of a political career that had just been dismantled piece by piece. And somewhere in the back of the chamber, Maria Gonzalez continued holding her husband's photograph toward the light so that the country could remember the cost of the words that had brought them all into that room.